Professional golfer Tommy Bolt was playing in a tournament, and he had a caddy who had a reputation of constant chatter. And so before they teed off, Bolt told him, "Don't say a word to me, and if I ask you something, just answer yes or no." And during the round, Bolt found a ball that was next to a tree where he had to hit under a branch and over a lake and then onto the green. And so he got down on his knees and he looked through the trees and he sized up the shot and he said, "What do you think?" He asked the caddy. "5 iron?" "No, Mr. Bolt," the caddy said. "What do you mean, not a 5 iron?" He snorted. "Watch this shot." The caddy rolled his eyes and said, "No, Mr. Bolt." But Bolt hit the ball and it stopped just 2 feet from the pin. And he turned to his caddy and handed him a 5 iron and said, "Well, what do you think about that? Now you can talk." And Mr. Bolt, the caddy said, "That wasn't your ball." It wasn't your ball. Now, I doubt any of us have experienced something so humbling, right? Just confidently moving forward, unaware of what's really happening, being ignorant even of just what we're actually doing and the danger of it. And that's why we need 1 Samuel 25. David is in the wilderness, and God is proving his ability to provide for him in the wilderness, proving that he can protect David from Saul, who's seeking to kill him, but there are other dangers in the wilderness. Last chapter, David resisted the temptation to kill Saul. He had the opportunity to kill God's anointed, but instead he trusted the Lord and his timing. And even Saul acknowledges this and David's righteousness, and he even admits that, yes, David will one day be king. But there are other dangers in the wilderness not named Saul. As we look at our chapter, we'll find 2 voices. We're going to find 2 characters speaking to David, and we're going to feel the tension of which one he's going to listen to. Let's look at chapter 25, beginning in verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. Then David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have to your servants and to your son David." When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us, both by night and by day. All the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him." Our chapter starts out with a bit of an ominous note, doesn't it? It says that Samuel, the prophet of the Lord, had died. Samuel was an incredible leader, right? The book is named after him, and we saw him at the beginning. But let's not forget the context. David is in the wilderness, he's on the run, and he loses his greatest ally, his greatest supporter, right? The one who had anointed him and had shared the Lord's will with him. And we'll come back to this, but let's not forget what that news must have felt like for David in the wilderness. Then in verse 3, we're introduced to Nabal and Abigail, two voices that David encounters in our chapter. How are they described? If you look at verse 3, Abigail is described as discerning and beautiful, and Nabal is described as harsh and badly behaved. Now, they're being intentionally compared here, right? And we might wonder, like maybe we do sometimes, is how would a guy like that get a girl like her, right? But that the greater comparison is moral in nature. Literally, it reads, Abigail was great as to discretion, whereas Nabal was evil as to his doings. So even Nabal's name, as we'll find out later, sounds like the word for fool. And if you're like, well, why would parents name him that? It was probably actually, his name meant noble, but if you just said it a little bit differently, it would come across as the same word for fool. And that's the first voice that we want to consider, and what it says, the voice of a fool. But Nabal is a powerful man in the region, and so David seeks his support. And through his messengers, he does so humbly. Now, listen, outlaws typically don't ask. What do? They just take, right? And instead, David and his men had shown Nabal's shepherds courtesy and even protected them. And so David goes and asks for support from Nabal. So David and his men are sort of like civilized outlaws. They ride around with ties, probably, right? In verse 14, according to Nabal's servants, they recount things to Abigail. And how did Nabal respond to David's men, according to his servants? In verse 14, it says, he railed at them. He shouted insults at them. He scorned them. The Hebrew can mean he even rushed them. He flew at them in anger. This is the first sign of a fool, responding in uncontrolled anger. Unchecked emotion. You know, Proverbs 29:11 was one of the first verses I memorized. A fool gives full vent to his anger, yet a wise man keeps himself under control. And this is what we find. Now, in Sunday school, we'll talk about, well, what about righteous anger, right? And I'd say, don't worry about it. More often than not, you know, when we go there so quickly, considering our anger, we're just trying to justify sinful anger, because that's what uncontrolled anger leads to, further sin and worse, as we'll find in our chapter. But that's not all we hear from the voice of a fool. Look at verse 17. As Nabal's servants continue to recount what happened to Abigail. In verse 17 he says, now therefore know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house. And he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. The word for harm or disaster is similar to the word for mean or evil in the description of Nabal back in verse 3. And it's as if these servants are worried. They're worried that the consequences for them will be in line with the character of their master. That his evil and his character and his doings is going to spread, and disaster will overtake them as well. But notice the comment at the end of the verse. It says, he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. A fool is unwilling to listen to the concerns of others, especially regarding himself. You know, I was talking with some guys this past week, and this came up. Right? Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy. Right? Proverbs 27:5-6. Is my heart soft enough to accept rebuke or concern from others, to consider their concerns, or am I just like a fool, unwilling to listen? Notice also how similar what's going on here is reflected in Saul and his family and their response to David. Saul definitely gives full vent to his spear-throwing anger, right, when it comes to David. But his son, his daughter, even his servants, we've seen in 1 Samuel, have all mentioned their concern for how Saul has been responding to David. They've gone to Saul and they've mentioned it to him. But like Nabal, he doesn't listen. This is what we see. A third characteristic from the voice of a fool can be found in Nabal's initial response back in verse 10. He says, how does he respond to David's messenger back in verse 10? He says, "Who is David? Who is this son of Jesse?" Where have we heard that response before? The most recent time we've heard that, "Who is this son of Jesse?" it comes from Doeg, Saul's servant, right back in chapter 22. The very one who killed the priests of the Lord, 88 of them. And this is not we've heard this from Saul himself back in chapter 20 as well. This is not an actual question, it's an insult. And in a minute, we'll see that Nabal's wife is fully aware of who David is. And so too, we can be sure that Nabal knows as well. But fools ignore God's purposes and promises. See, David had been anointed as the Lord's chosen king over Israel. But Nabal shows his colors, right, by asking, "Who is this son of Jesse?" It might seem, as we look at this and we see the voice of a fool, it might seem that the foolishness of Nabal is so outrageous that there's no way that David could be tempted to listen to the voice of the fool. But what in our verses might make us think otherwise? What is David's initial response to Nabal's rejection back in verse 13? When he hears how his servants have been treated and Nabal responds, what does he say? "Every man strap on your sword," right? And then David does as well. "Let's teach him a lesson." This is what David's response is like. There's an exclamation mark there. I don't think he said it. Maybe he did say it calmly and coolly. But his heart was hot within him. "Every man strap on his sword." We'll see in a minute that he even made a vow to kill every man belonging to Nabal. David is acting in line with Nabal. Uncontrolled anger with the potential to lead to further sin. So we have this tension building, and we're wondering, will David continue to listen to the voice of the fool? And let's look at verse 18. "Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, 'Go on before me. Behold, I come after you.' But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her. And she met them. Now David had said, 'Surely in vain I have guarded all this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him.' When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, 'On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. You know, these verses really show us the earlier description of Abigail's discernment and wisdom, don't they? You know, in contrast to her husband, she's presented as the voice of wisdom to David. And after hearing her servants and what went on, she responds quickly. She gets together this tribute for David, and she sets out to meet him. And wouldn't you know it, as she's traveling, she just happens to meet David on the way to attack Nabal and his household. It's sort of like the timing is just quite interesting, right? What a coincidence, we might say. What is David's, well, we recognize it's also interesting how Abigail's actions in verses 23 and 24, they mimic David's response to Saul in our last chapter. If you remember, back in the last chapter, David, what did he do? He prostrated himself and showed humility to the one seeking to take his life. He bowed before Saul, and here, Abigail does the same. But it's her words that carry the most wisdom. Notice how she directly combats the voice of the fool. Look at verse 26. She says, "Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do you evil to my Lord be as Nabal." The voice of wisdom is one that restrains one from anger and further sin, that restrains one from that. This is the blood guilt that she's talking about. In verse 31, she describes this as the shedding of innocent blood, or a shedding of blood without cause. So what she does is she attempts to dissuade David, to get him off track from continuing down this path of uncontrolled anger, which leads to violence and more sin. David has realized this with Saul, but not with Nabal. But she uses another phrase that's important here in verse 26. She says that the Lord has restrained David from blood guilt and from what else? Saving with your own hand. Saving with your own hand. This is to pursue self-salvation, taking matters into his own hand, strapping on his sword, right, rather than trusting the Lord. The voice of wisdom calls us, it restrains us from schemes of self-salvation, of working salvation for ourselves. That's what Abigail calls it again in verse 31. David has done this well so far as he's encountered Saul in the wilderness. But notice in here in chapter 25 that Nabal has hit a nerve. He's hit a nerve in David. And this is true of other people in our lives. There might be some that they just bounce off, but there's certain people sometimes that hit a nerve. And with him, David wants to be judge and executioner rather than wait for the Lord. After all, who knows how long the Lord will take in bringing justice? And this really strikes at one of the main issues here for David is what? It's self-control. You know, in Titus 2, Paul gives a list of things. I always think this is fascinating. He gives a list of things for older men, for older women, even for younger women to do. He gives a list of things that would honor the Lord. But then he has only one thing for Titus to tell younger men. Urge younger men to be self-controlled. To be self-controlled. One of the best definitions that I've heard for self-control is from Tim Keller, and it's the ability to do the important thing rather than the urgent thing. The ability to do the important thing rather than the urgent thing. See, the urgent thing for David was to teach Nabal a lesson. Did Nabal need teaching? Well, probably. He probably did. But the important thing for David was not to sin in his anger and to become guilty and then trust in his own vengeance and actually, as he goes down this path, to begin to look more and more like the king he's supposed to replace. That's the important thing. And because that's the last thing that Abigail and the voice of wisdom encourages. It's to live in light of the Lord's purposes and promises. Look at verse 28 and how she says, please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. God is going to establish you, David. He's going to establish you. He's going to take care of you. And then listen to verse 30. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. See, what Abigail does is she ties David's response in the moment to what God has called him to in the future. The role he's called him to, the purposes and plans he has for David. And this is what, to him, being future king of Israel. See, behavior like murdering those who insult you or get in your way, it might be fitting for a fool like Nabal. But not for God's anointed king. Live in light of God's purposes for you. That's wisdom. So how will David respond? We're sort of left, she gives her appeal. We've heard the voice of a fool. We've heard the voice of wisdom. Which one will he listen to? He's already sort of pursuing the voice of a fool. But look at verse 32. And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you. Unless you had hurried and come to me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition." And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him. And in the morning, merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. And in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. And when the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to take you to him as his wife." And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your handmaid is a servant, to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galem. Now, we might wish that David would just stick to one life. Come on, man. Only trouble results from that, right? But it's hard to ignore his humility here in this situation with Nabal. Look back at verse 32. He blesses the Lord for the Lord's wisdom to him through Abigail. David recognizes it as such. And what does he do? He listens to her. This is no small thing. His ears were not blocked enough with anger that wisdom could not get through to him. And then we find, secondly, in verse 39, that he blesses the Lord for his vindication, right, and judgment of Nabal. The Lord seems to be waiting with Saul, right? But with Nabal, he only takes 10 days. And because of that, David blesses the Lord for protecting him from future sin. Right? He says, you have kept your servant back from wrongdoing. David recognizes that all of this is from the Lord. All of this is from him. But one last note, isn't it interesting? Isn't the timing interesting? That at the beginning of the chapter, as David has just lost a great and godly supporter in Samuel, that by the end of the chapter, he gains a great and godly supporter in Abigail. Surely the life of David was bound up in the bundle of the living, in the care of the Lord his God. And surely our lives are as well. You know, a Hungarian refugee with the pseudonym Joseph Kudar was a successful lawyer in Hungary before the uprising in those countries in 1956. And when the uprisings against the Soviets failed, he was forced to flee the country because he was a part of those. And when Kudar arrived in the U.S., he had no money, no job, and no friends. He was, however, well educated. He spoke and he wrote in several languages, including English. And for several months, he tried to get a job in a law office, but because of his lack of familiarity with American law, he received only sort of polite refusals. Finally, it occurred to him that with his knowledge of language, he might be able to get a job with an import-export company. And so he selected one such company, and he wrote a letter to the owner. And 2 weeks later, he received an answer, but it was hardly prepared for the vindictiveness of the man's reply. Among other things, it said that even if they did need someone, they wouldn't hire him because he couldn't even write good English. Crushed, Kudar's hurt quickly turned to anger. What right did this rude, arrogant man have to tell him that he couldn't write the language? This man was obviously crude and uneducated. His letter was chock full of grammatical errors. And so Kudar sat down, and in the white heat of anger, he wrote a scathing reply, calculated to rip the man to shreds. And when he had finished, however, as he was reading it over, his anger began to drain away. Then he remembered the biblical admonition, a soft answer turneth away wrath. Maybe the man was right. You know, English wasn't his native tongue. Maybe he did need further study in it. Maybe this man had even done him a favor by making him realize that he needed to work on perfecting his English. So Kudar tore up the letter and wrote another. And this time he apologized for the previous letter. He explained his situation, and he thanked the man for pointing out his need for further study. 2 days later, he received a phone call inviting him to New York for an interview. A week later, he went to work for them as a correspondent, and later, Joseph Kudar became vice president and executive officer of the company, succeeding the man that he had hated and sought revenge against. See, God's grace comes not only in forgiveness of past sin, but in protection from future sin. See, God is gracious not only to forgive past sin, but to protect us from future sin in our lives. And what we see in our passage is that not only does the Lord protect David from enemies like Saul, the Lord protects David from enemies like himself. That pull to lose control over our feelings, that pull to take matters into our own hands, the pull to teach others a lesson, the pull to act less and less like a recipient of God's grace, less and less like the witness he calls us to be. And so let me encourage us this morning to welcome wisdom. To welcome wisdom, to welcome the voice of wisdom in our lives. And to apply this, we have to do something difficult, you know. It's to invite someone who knows you, who knows the Lord, and to invite them to speak the truth in love to us this week. Invite them to maybe phone them up, maybe give them a call or invite them for a walk and ask them, what's one area in my life, one area of concern that you see in my life that might be attempting to compromise God's good purposes and plans for me? What might be one area that just sort of seems out of line with his will? And his word, maybe it's anger leading to sin. Maybe it's attempts at earning God's favor, self-salvation like we see in the text. Maybe it's just sort of neglecting God's goodwill for you. But welcome wisdom. Can we do that? Can we handle that? Can we listen to wisdom? You know, I say it, but it's so easier said than done. If you're wondering who to ask, you know, it might make sense, especially today, to ask your mother, right? To ask her if she's alive and she knows the Lord, or maybe even your mother-in-law, and to ask her those questions, to ask her if there's something that she sees in your life that's out of line. Ask her, invite her, and then bless her. Bless her for it. May we be the kind of people that welcome wisdom as we trust the Lord together. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your care for us. A care that comes not only in the forgiveness of our sin through Jesus Christ, but care that comes in protection from sin through your Holy Spirit. Help us, Father, to listen to your wisdom that comes from your word, often through the lips of your people. Help us to receive it. God, help us to grow in relationship with one another so that we may be able to speak the truth in love with one another. And God, if we don't have relationships like that, God, help us to pursue those, to be intentional. God, may we sharpen one another. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for your people. In Jesus' name, amen.